Abibi Fahoudier and blessings to the ancestors. Is Deshaun here from OPP bringing you a new video here to discuss the topic of the British and their self-righteous cause to abolish slavery as a convenient defense mechanism to shield itself from its slave trading and colonial past. We're going to clear all of the myth put out by British propaganda by providing historical data that contradict their so-called moral crusade. Pun intended. To start off, let's give a general overview of British abolition. During the 18th century, holier-than-thou Anglo-Saxon Christians in Britain and partly throughout Western Europe, interestingly, began questioning the quote-unquote moral validity of the Atlantic slave trade. As a self-professed Christian society, British abolitionists started ironically highlighting the moral contradiction that their religion teaches while being fully aware of the immoral actions that their government and society were engaging in via the slave trade. So over the course of the 18th century, pockets of this movement grew legs not only in England, but also in its colonies in the Americas and the Caribbean, and began to apply pressure to end the slave trade. These early attempts fell on deaf ears due to the profitability of the slave trade, which I will be describing soon. However, I don't take the position that this was a general moral crusade. After all, the British, along with their European rivals, waged vicious wars to open Africa to conquer lands and capture slaves. So where was this moral outrage between the 16th and 18th centuries? From my view, the true engine that drove British abolition was their economic motives. By the start of the 19th century, Britain had emerged as the world's leading superpower with a global colonial empire, a dynamic economy built off the exploitation of those colonies, and a superior naval force that flexed its muscle on the seas. However, competition amongst its European rivals, namely France and Spain, caused England to lose significant market share in the key economic areas that its colonies produced, such as sugar. While the economic productivity from the import of African slaves produced fabulous profits and wealth between the 16th and 18th century, two key economic factors changed the tide against the favorability of the slave trade. The first being the lack of productivity of English slave owners in the Caribbean. Britain found itself subsidizing unprofitable plantations by the start of the 19th century that could no longer compete with neighboring European colonies, such as Spain's more fertile colonies in the sugar market. Eric Williams, in the History of the Caribbean, provides examples of this economic dynamic, stating, "From the metropolitan standpoint, the days of mercantilism were over. The West Indies represented shrinking markets, and they produced more expensive sugar, which competed with that of better customers of the metropoles," in reference to India and Brazil, which was a Spanish colony. Ultimately, British capital viewed the dying market they initially financed centuries earlier, as stated by Williams. A considerable portion of the slaves were non-productive hanger-oners on the big house, ministering the social status rather than the economic aspect of the plantation economy. Therefore, arguments against the slave trade due to the cost of not only capturing but also housing and maintaining slaves and their plantations became increasingly a viable argument in the eyes of British capitalists and its elites. The second, and from my view the most important reason, was the advent of industrialization. By the 19th century, the profits and wealth generated by British capitalism enabled it to finance research and science, to create labor-saving tools, to cut costs, and to increase efficiency in comparison to enslaved labor, enabling the British to compete economically with their rivals for cheaper products at better prices and maximize profits. The result of this entered the age of the Industrial Revolution, which saw the inventions of the steam engine and electric power that empowered formerly agrarian peasants of Western Europe to be able to operate large machinery, to which increasingly outpaced human slave labor of African descent. As time went on, these groups of growing white industrial urban workers wanted the English elite to focus its capital on industrial development for its native population. Williams references this point by stating, From the standpoint of the metropolitan politics, the abolition of the Caribbean slave system was, on one hand, a part of a general struggle of the industrial bourgeoisie against the landed aristocracy, which began in France with the French Revolution and it advanced in England with the first Reform Bill of 1832. On the other hand, the emancipation of slaves was part of the general movement of the European industrial proletariat towards democracy. The centers of agitation against slavery were the great industrial towns of Manchester, Birmingham, and Paris. To further support my argument, let's use the United States, another slaveholding society, who had a similar industrial segment of their British counterparts by the mid-19th century. By this time, northern states along the east coast of the United States, such as New England, also began to develop their own industrial revolution by developing new machines and technology that led to a growing white industrial class. As this class began to grow, Northern elites began espousing similar arguments to abolish slavery due to its inefficiency. In Edward Baptist's work, The Half Never Told, he describes this northern thinking, stating, Northerners were convincing themselves that slavery was a pre-modern, inefficient drain on the national economy. Northern observers and activists saw the slower recovery of the Southern economy and thought it proved that slavery was an economic incubus and not an engine of growth. The newly emerging Northern critique of enslavers and their allies who demanded that America purge itself of its sins, arguing that Southern slavery damaged the national economy. However, New England lords of the loom had used slave-made cotton and slavery's markets to become the wealthiest people in the free states. These quotes contrast well with their British counterparts. The reason why this is important is because in the late 18th century, it was these industrial centers who were becoming increasingly wealthy off of the power of industrialization who inevitably financed the abolitionist movement in England and America. As the prior quote stated, overall, the slave trade produced many benefits to British and Western society by having free enslaved labor for several centuries to extract the raw materials needed for British capitalism and the workers to work the plantations that grew the products that helped generate those profits. However, once the wealth was generated and the slavery was no longer considered efficient, it hypocritically shunned the activity that helped make them wealthy and powerful. The same applies to the American North. In addition to this self-righteous hypocrisy, Britain also tried to impose its lofty and abolitionist goals on their European counterparts. The same competitors such as Spain, who were dominating the sugar markets via the colonies in the Caribbean, and were still active in importing African slaves who were contributing to their success. As summarized accurately by Williams, the campaign against the foreign slave trade failed because British capitalism was heavily invested in the trade with Latin America, particularly Brazil and Cuba. It could not kill the goose that laid the golden eggs. It cannot oppose the introduction of slaves who produced the sugar and coffee that made possible the purchase of British textiles and provided freight for British ships. So hopefully, I've dispelled this self-righteous notion that the British abolished the slave trade for moral reasons. Well, for now, I'm out. If you guys are interested in the original People's Party and want to contribute your skill sets or your talents to our African Development Program, the link is in the description for more information. And you can follow me on all social media at D1Beats on all social media. And until next time, a Bibi Fahudie and blessings to the ancestors.